Welcome to WorkSpan TV. I'm Ryan Johnson from WorldatWork. I'm joined in the studio today by Dave Swinford, Meyer Partners. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming in. So we want to talk about this new 2011 survey on executive pay for performance that was conducted by Meyer Partners along with NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, and with the support of WorldatWork. Very interesting new survey data, Dave, and I want to cover that. First thing out of the box, of course, is this idea of the difference in opinion between the directors and the managers in an organization. Can you talk about that in the context of the survey?
Ryan, that was actually a key thing we were looking for when we did the survey. We talked to 240 people, of whom 179 were management team members and 61 were directors. And we found that they had slightly different perspectives that we hadn't really quantified before, although we may have sensed when we've talked with directors in compensation committee meetings. Management tends to focus in performance measurement on setting absolute goals and achieving those goals. And directors are much more interested in relative performance, that is, performance compared to peers. And that is a trend that has really increased over the course of the last couple of years, in large part because we've had difficulty setting goals in a very uncertain economic environment, and companies have struggled to set goals that are realistic and then hold to those goals over the course of a performance period. So managers tend to focus on absolute measures, and compensation committee members tend to think a little bit more about relative measures. Everybody's very interested in financial performance, of course, our traditional measures like EPS and operating income and cash flow and those kinds of things. What is very interesting is that both sides, both management and directors, have started to focus more in recent years on what we call strategic performance measures. So it's not just enough to achieve your financial goals for the year, or maybe even your stock price goals for the year or for a 3-year period. The execution of your business strategy successfully over a period of time is very, very important to directors.
Do you think this shift that you've just pointed out, Dave, do you think this is a result of the volatility that's occurred in the last few years in the stock markets and with stock prices fluctuating the way they have?
I think that's a contributing factor. I think the other thing that comes into the idea that regardless of the current economic conditions, we have to build the business for the future, is that the world has become much more competitive. And companies that used to be successful against a relatively small group of peers are finding that there are more and more companies globally that are attacking them. And the idea of revitalizing the business, renewing the business on a regular basis, regardless of what the current economic results are, what the current budget is very, very important. So people are becoming more long-term oriented in a world where there's a lot more short-term pressure, which I think is kind of an interesting result.
So the survey is obviously pay for performance. How are companies defining pay for performance?
Well, I think pay for performance for annual plans is achieving the budget, and the budget tends to include the financial measures. They're typically an earnings kind of measure. There's typically a return kind of measure that gets focused on, so mixing income statement and balance sheet. In the annual plans, you rarely see relative performance. Directors are very interested in how you did against peers on the financial measures, especially if you fell short of your goal, but annual performance is very hard to measure on a relative basis. In the longer term plans, relative performance is much more important, especially for directors. Directors are very interested in relative performance over our 3, 4, and 5-year plans, and it's just not relative total shareholder return, which is the first measure we tend to focus on. It's relative earnings growth and other relative kinds of measures. In both the annual and the long-term plans, as I mentioned before, this idea of the strategic or the business building measures and goals is becoming increasingly important.
The survey, of course, is rich with data. Dave, I wonder if you could speak to maybe 1 or 2 findings that are particularly relevant to a human resource or a compensation professional who might be a WorldatWork member who might be watching this.
I think that there is a very interesting set of perspectives around the use of discretion in measuring performance. We've always thought of discretion as something that it's a powerful tool and it has to be used carefully, because too much discretion causes lots of folks to be suspicious that we're forgiving failure to perform. What's interesting is that management teams typically are suspicious of discretion. They're concerned that somehow they won't get the fair rewards for overachieving that they expected. Directors view discretion as, especially in the annual plans, the way of adjusting the results to reflect the fact that it's very hard to set goals in a world of which we have relatively little knowledge, which is how we seem to have operated the last couple of years. So directors would like to sort of fix the results of the plan, but directors have a tendency to think of that as adjusting the whole plan up or down. Whereas managers historically have thought of discretion as making up for a shortfall in an incentive award for a business unit head, for example, who was particularly disadvantaged by business conditions that didn't impact everybody else in the company, or for providing some extra reward to somebody who achieved some extraordinary feat that was not actually within the incentive plan goals. Directors are less likely than management to think of discretion as an individual performance feature. They think of it as for the entire group. And the other thing that we found interesting was that directors really don't think that much of individual performance and incentive plans altogether. They also tend not to think very much of business unit goals. Now remember, their purview typically is the very top of the house, and it's the top management team, and they do tend to look at everybody based upon company results.
Dave, I want to thank you for coming in today and sharing with us the results of the 2011 Pay for Performance Survey by Pearl Meyer Partners, NACD, and supported by WorldatWork. And for WorkSpan TV and WorldatWork, I am Ryan Johnson.